Welcome to the 2021 World Conference of the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children. I'm Julia Link Roberts, the current president of the World Council, and I am delighted that we are gathering together for the 24th World Conference. Our organization began with a meeting in London in 1975, 46 years ago. Since that time, the World Council has contributed to the field of gifted education in myriad ways. The journal, Gifted and Talented International, has provided a publishing opportunity for scholars around the world. The website at the World Council is a treasure trove of information about the organization and the field of gifted education with a global perspective. Information is made available periodically in the World Gifted newsletter and on an ongoing basis via social media. As participants in the 24th World Conference, I have a few questions to pose. Have you participated in other World Conferences? If so, which ones? Do you access the World Council's social media? Did you watch any of the videos that provided glimpses into sessions that will be offered at this conference? If we were meeting in person, I would hope to see hands waving in answer to those questions. During this conference, the World Council will release a new document, Global Principles for Professional Learning in Gifted Education. The 10 principles outlined in this document can guide decision-making in numerous situations at local, regional, and national levels. I extend my thanks to Dr. Norma Haferstein, who led the initiative, and to the members of this committee from around the globe who offered their perspectives to the work, and to the writers who wrote pieces to support the various principles and edited the final document. The World Council brings together many people interested in gifted children. In different countries, as well as in regions within countries, the terms used in referring to gifted children vary widely. Yet in all countries, there are children with gifts and talents in school, making it important to provide guidance for those preparing teachers, policymakers who shape teaching in schools, and the educators who are in classrooms, whether in person or virtually. The World Conference has a new look as it is being hosted virtually. To accommodate a worldwide membership, the conference is being offered in 3 time zones, which I hope will help you participate. The recordings of sessions will make the presentations available for you to enjoy and learn from long after the conference has concluded. As we begin this World Conference, I want to thank the members of the Executive Committee for their leadership throughout the 4 years of my presidency. I want to thank the staff at the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University for the various ways they assisted in the preparation for this conference. I want to thank Dr. Tyler Clark for all the planning he has done to put this 24th World Conference together. And I also want to thank you, members of the World Council, for participating in this conference. And now it's time to start the 24th World Conference of the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children. Let the World Conference begin.
Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first ever virtual World Conference. It's my distinct honor to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Rinn. Dr. Rinn is Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of North Texas, where she also serves as Director of the Center for Giftedness, Talent Development, and Creativity. She has authored around 75 publications related to the social and emotional development of gifted and talented individuals and the psychosocial skills necessary for the development of talent. She is the co-editor of the 2017 book of From Giftedness to Gifted Education, Reflecting Theory and Practice, and author of the 2020 book, Social, Emotional, and Psychosocial Development of Gifted and Talented Individuals. Currently, she is the co-editor of the Journal of Advanced Academics. Though Dr. Rinn did not include it in her bio, I think it's important to highlight her incredible mentorship of graduate students and early career researchers at the University of North Texas and beyond. More personally, I had the honor of having Dr. Rinn serve as one of the committee members on my dissertation, and she was the first person to call me Dr. Clark. Her work is profound in the field, and I think you'll be enlightened by her keynote. Before we begin, I must also thank Proofrock Press for sponsoring Dr. Rinn's keynote. As Dr. Rinn's presentation is happening, please post questions you may have for her, and we will invite her to respond to some of those questions as time allows at the end. Thank you and enjoy.
Everyone, my name is Rinn. I am so pleased to be here to talk with you all about the state of research on the social and emotional development of gifted and talented individuals, as well as to discuss how we can shift our research to move the field forward in this area. I've been studying the social and emotional development of gifted students for quite some time now. During my sophomore year in my undergraduate studies, I came across a statement about gifted children and their self-concepts that caught my attention in a psychology textbook for an introductory psychology course I was taking, largely as I was someone identified for gifted services in elementary school and was familiar with that label. I ended up writing my final paper in that class about the importance of self-concept among gifted children. That was 20 years ago this year. My research has broadened over the past 20 years, naturally, but one of the main constructs I still focus on in my research is self-beliefs. Today, I would like to talk to you about how I see that the field of gifted education has shifted over the past few decades and how that impacts our understanding of the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted students. I would like to explore with you the ways in which our definition of giftedness has impacted the way we view and study the social and emotional development of gifted students, as well as explore the ways in which we can move the field forward in our understanding of that social and emotional development while encompassing a variety of perspectives on giftedness and talent. Much of what led me to explore what I will talk to you about today had to do with beliefs about gifted students that differed between teachers, administrators, and parents, and between different groups of researchers in the field of gifted education. Beliefs like gifted people are more sensitive than other people, and being gifted means also having some quirks, led me to want to dig into the empirical research to see exactly what is meant by comments like this, but also to see what evidence we might have for such comments. If gifted students are indeed that different from other students, then it impacts how we would serve gifted students. Anyone designing programs, curriculum, services, and so on for gifted students needs to have a basic understanding of giftedness and talent development, but they also need to understand the human being behind that gifted label. And implicit beliefs about gifted students and their social and emotional development impact the way in which we serve these students and the ways in which we conduct research about these individuals. There are a number of questions to consider as we think about the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted students. Do gifted individuals have unique characteristics and/or social and emotional experiences that render them particularly vulnerable to an array of social and emotional difficulties? In 2009, Peterson asked whether, and I quote, "the characteristics associated with giftedness make the subjective experience of meeting normal challenges qualitatively different from others' experience." So in other words, do gifted individuals have unique social and emotional needs? Are the social and emotional difficulties some gifted individuals face due to the interaction with an environment that does not facilitate the development of their talents? And on that note, which psychosocial skills matter in the development of talent? What I've found is that different groups, meaning parents, teachers, researchers, and so on, have different answers to these questions. And their answers seem to stem from their implicit and explicit beliefs about giftedness. And much of that is because the groups define giftedness differently. For example, in talking about the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted individuals, some folks are talking about clients with very high IQs in a psychology service center. Some are talking about adult Mensa members. Some are talking about their own gifted or twice exceptional children. Some are talking about undergraduate honor students. Some are talking about high school advanced placement or international baccalaureate students. And some are talking about elementary school students identified on their campus for gifted services. These samples of so-called gifted students are not the same. Our description of the social and emotional experiences of individuals with IQs in the top 2% of the population is not the same as our description of the social and emotional experiences of high school students taking advanced placement courses, for example. So it would be unreasonable to generalize from one so-called gifted sample to another so-called gifted sample if those gifted samples don't match. And it explains a lot about why there is such conflicting evidence in the area of social and emotional research in this field. So in other words, your definition of giftedness impacts the way in which you both ask and answer questions about the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted individuals. Our definitions of giftedness can be looked at in a few ways, all of which have different implications for the way we ask and answer questions about the social and emotional experiences of gifted students. Several researchers have reviewed the paradigm shifts that have happened in our field over the past century. Lowe and Porath, for example, identified 3 paradigms in gifted education. Early conceptions of giftedness involved demystification, as giftedness was seen as some sort of manifested wonder. In modern times, we've focused on the identification of giftedness, such that giftedness is something that can be measured through an IQ test or ability test. Currently, Lowe and Porath suggest the field is moving toward transaction, or a focus on the effectuation of human possibilities, or what some like Subotnick and colleagues call talent development. Lowe and Porath note in 2017 at least, that there is still an implicit focus on the identification paradigm. Dai and Chen, in their 2013 paper and 2014 book, also explore paradigmatic shifts in gifted education, with some overlap in the way Lowe and Porath explored the shifts as seen here. Note the differences in preferred terminology and the shift away from using the gifted label. Note too where your own implicit and explicit beliefs about giftedness fall, and consider how that shapes the way you ask and answer questions about the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted students. Dai and Chen also argue the field of gifted education is dominated by 3 paradigms, with 2 being most prevalent, namely the gifted child paradigm and the talent development paradigm. Giftedness was operationalized as a high IQ starting with the advent of the IQ test in the early 1900s, and Terman's longitudinal study of gifted children starting in the 1920s. This definition was pervasive until the 1980s and 1990s, when competing definitions and models really started showing up in the field of gifted education. But giftedness based on high IQ or high ability level is still extremely pervasive today. The gifted child paradigm is based on this notion, as well as that gifted children are a distinct category with unique social and emotional needs, that gifted children should be educated differently than other children, and that once gifted, always gifted, meaning the unique experiences that come along with having a high IQ or the label gifted stay with someone throughout adulthood. Much of the research in the field of gifted education that pertains to the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted individuals is conducted through this paradigmatic lens. Studies that compare gifted individuals to non-gifted individuals fall into this category, as do studies that examine how issues like perfectionism, sensitivity, and overexcitabilities are experienced with samples of gifted people. One of the major premises of the gifted child paradigm is that gifted children experience asynchronous development, or an uneven rate of development across cognitive, social, emotional, and physical stages. However, this is really only meant to apply to individuals with a very high IQ, which can cause some confusion in this field. Gifted individuals go through the same stages of human development that apply to individuals of other ability levels, whether physical, cognitive, social, or emotional, but their developmental transitions and experiences may differ from individuals of other ability levels if we are defining giftedness based on general intellectual ability or IQ. From the gifted child paradigmatic perspective, social and emotional developmental experiences differ between gifted and non-gifted people. Theories of development are based on typical human development, such that developmental milestones and trajectories are fairly consistent across most typically developing individuals. There are no theories to explain how advanced intellectual ability affects one's social and emotional development, or if it does at all. There is no evidence to suggest that social and emotional development occurs early or is accelerated among intellectually gifted individuals per se. However, one assumption of the gifted child paradigm is that the advanced cognitive and intellectual developmental trajectory will differ from the typically paced social and emotional developmental trajectory and may alter it. Atypical intellectual and cognitive trajectories may lead to a unique social and emotional developmental process, which leads to the assumption that gifted children have different social and emotional needs than average ability children, and that they are vulnerable to an array of issues if those social and emotional needs are not addressed. This assumption has dominated the field for many, many years. However, let's take two constructs often examined in research from the gifted child paradigmatic lens. I've pulled two recent meta-analyses for each construct. You'll see that two independent meta-analyses found gifted individuals scored higher on measures of emotional intelligence than non-gifted individuals. And you'll see that in two meta-analyses, results showed that there is no significant difference regarding perfectionism between gifted and non-gifted students. These findings provide support for the idea that gifted individuals are pretty socially and emotionally healthy and not necessarily at risk for something like perfectionism. However, the idea that people with a high IQ are socially and emotionally vulnerable persists in this field. If giftedness is viewed as something broader than just high IQ, for example, as advanced academic abilities or domain-specific talents, then a focus on unique social and emotional issues among the gifted becomes somewhat irrelevant because the group included as gifted is much larger in this operationalization of giftedness. Giftedness based on only a high IQ includes less than 3% of the population who may have unique social and emotional experiences, although the evidence is limited. But giftedness based on domain-specific abilities comprises a much larger group of people that is even less homogeneous than those in the top 3% of the normal distribution. And it becomes more difficult to pinpoint unique social and emotional experiences with such a diverse group of people. The focus thus becomes on factors that influence the development of talent rather than factors that differentiate one group of folks from another. Researchers and practitioners who focus on the circumstances in which domain-specific talent develops within an individual have paradigmatic beliefs that align with the talent development paradigm. Although the possibility that general intelligence plays a role in a particular line of talent development is not excluded, the talent development paradigm assumes a broader psychosocial basis of gifted and talented potential, stressing the evolving, changing, and increasingly differentiated or domain-specific nature of talent, the significant role of motivation and other psychosocial skills, the role of timely opportunity and in-depth domain experiences, differential trajectories and pathways across domains, and technical and social support like mentoring and psychosocial interventions throughout the process of talent development. Just focusing on the social and emotional component of the talent development paradigm, we can see that the focus is on what has been termed psychosocial skills. In the field of gifted education, numerous studies on the motivation and self-beliefs of gifted students exist, for example, often as studies comparing the constructs between gifted and non-gifted samples, or as studies examining the role one of these psychosocial skills plays in achievement or success. In their talent development mega model, Subotnick and colleagues note that opportunity and motivation are central to the development of talent, as are persistence, exertion of effort, task commitment, passion, interest, social skills, willingness to take strategic risks, the ability to cope with challenges and handle criticism, and competitiveness, among others. Lipnovich and colleagues, in a handbook about the relevance of psychosocial skills in schools for all children, focused on many of the same psychosocial skills and adding things like the big 5 personality factors, and particularly the role conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience play in doing well in school. We can see that there is some overlap in the way we think about social and emotional experiences and needs across paradigms, mostly, obviously, in the overlapping examination of some constructs like self-beliefs and emotional intelligence, but the lens through which you examine those constructs differs and has different implications. Regardless of your implicit beliefs about giftedness and the paradigmatic lens through which you approach the study of giftedness and gifted education, there are commonalities across paradigms. All of us here have goals related to better identifying and serving gifted and talented students, for example. Diane Chen also said, There is consensus that something more than general intellectual ability is at play in reaching high levels of excellence. The paradigms use different terms to describe this something more, typically social and emotional needs from the gifted child paradigmatic lens, and psychosocial skills from the talent development paradigmatic lens. Regardless then of one's theoretical or paradigmatic perspective, the focus on the social, emotional, and psychosocial development of gifted and talented individuals is important. Healthy social and emotional development affects the ability to develop psychosocial skills. As such, both social and emotional development and needs and psychosocial skills should be researched in our field. In 2002, Nyhart and colleagues published a book about the state of research on the social and emotional development of gifted children, which was the result of the work of a task force put together by the National Association for Gifted Children and the National Research Center on the Gifted and Talented in the United States. That book was written from a gifted child paradigmatic lens, which also dominated the field at the time, and really focused on gifted children as a group with unique social and emotional experiences and needs. 20 years later, our understanding about the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted individuals has expanded, largely because the definition of giftedness has expanded, as I outline in the book I published last year. However, there is so much more room for research in the area of social and emotional development that could contribute further to the field of gifted education as a whole. So what should the next decade or two of research on the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted individuals look like? How can we move the field forward by providing more information about these individuals so that teachers, administrators, and researchers can better serve them? This list is by no means exhaustive, but I offer 5 areas of focus for advancing research on the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted students. First, we should focus more on how we operationalize terms used in research related to the social and emotional experiences of gifted individuals. Specifically, and I'll talk about these separately, we need to operationalize the term gifted in every study. Second, we need to spend time defining the constructs we are measuring in our study from a theoretical or conceptual lens, and also from a measurement lens. For example, it wouldn't make sense to conduct a study on perfectionism while discussing perfectionism through one theoretical lens in the literature review, but measuring it using a measure designed for a different theoretical lens. It isn't reasonable to make broad, sweeping claims like gifted people have different social and emotional needs and experiences than non-gifted people, because the sample of gifted individuals used could differ so drastically from another sample of gifted individuals that we end up with little consensus. So let's use the study of the mental health of gifted individuals to illustrate. Most of the research on IQ and mental health is conducted with average IQ samples, and most of the research is conducted on adult samples. Most findings indicate higher IQ is associated with more favorable outcomes, including good mental health. However, because most research is conducted with samples having an IQ in the average range, there is less known about the mental health of folks with very high IQs. Karpinski and colleagues, for example, recently argued that the relationship between IQ and mental health isn't linear, but is likely curvilinear, such that after a threshold, the higher the IQ, the greater likelihood of mental health issues. Their findings lend support for this hypothesized curvilinear relationship, at least at face value, as they found that highly intelligent individuals are at a significantly greater risk for mood and anxiety disorders, ADHD, and conditions involving inflammation and dysregulation of the immune system, such as allergies, asthma, and autoimmune disease, when compared to national averages. They term this finding the hyperbrain hyperbody association. I quote from page 15 of their paper. The model posits a unique psychoneuroimmunological process such that those with a hyperbrain in the form of a very superior cognitive ability lend themselves to a greater tendency to respond to environmental stressors by ruminating and worrying, which are positive predictors of risk for psychological overexcitabilities leading to affective disorders. These disorders are closely associated with a hyperbody, which manifests in physiological overexcitabilities, which take the form of immune and inflammatory dysregulation, which can also bidirectionally instigate psychological effects, end quote. Some of you may recall this paper made the rounds on social media and quickly went from a discussion about the study to use of the study as evidence to support the idea that gifted children are uniquely at risk for various social and emotional issues. There are major issues with that generalization for numerous reasons, but I'll outline two. First, the sample used in this study consisted of nearly 4,000 adult members of Mensa. Comparing nearly 4,000 adults with a high IQ who self-selected into a high IQ society to children identified for gifted services in elementary school is very problematic. How Karpinski and colleagues operationalize giftedness, namely that of an IQ high enough to qualify for Mensa, isn't generalizable to studies of children who may be identified as gifted. In a systematic literature review of 18 studies that examined the relationship between intellectual giftedness and psychopathology in children and adolescents, Francis and colleagues in 2016 found that most gifted children and adolescents demonstrated superior socio-emotional adjustment and fewer behavioral difficulties than their typically developing peers. Any mental health problems that rise during childhood could be due to a plethora of environmental and individual factors, but high ability likely does not cause these mental health problems. There is no evidence to suggest gifted individuals are socially and emotionally immature or at risk. Having a very high IQ could very likely be related to some unique social and emotional experiences, but one cannot say that a very high IQ causes unique social, emotional, or psychological experiences. And we certainly cannot generalize from a study on adults to our understanding of children. A second major issue with the Karpinski et al. Study is their heavy reliance on the construct of overexcitabilities to explain their findings. For example, is there something unique about adults with a high IQ who voluntarily apply for and join Mensa that may better explain the relationship they found between mental and physical health among folks with a high IQ? Some research has recently been published on the construct of overexcitabilities to suggest they can better be explained by the Big Five personality factor, openness to experience. Could it be that folks with a certain personality typology are more likely to join Mensa than others? And that personality typology could better explain the findings of the study than the notion of overexcitabilities? This leads to the importance of defining constructs you are measuring in your research. Earlier, I mentioned you wouldn't describe perfectionism one way in the literature review and then measure it using a measure designed for a different study of perfectionism. This is related to the jingle-jangle fallacy. The jingle-jangle fallacy is a phrase first coined by Kelly in 1927 in reference to construct measurement issues. When two scales with similar names measure different constructs, this is the jingle fallacy. Regarding the construct of perfectionism, there are numerous definitions and ways to measure perfectionism in the research literature. For example, there are actually two scales that have an identical name. The multidimensional perfectionism scale. In the Frost et al. Version from 1990, the multidimensional perfectionism scale measures 6 factors of perfectionism. In the Hewitt and Flett version from 1991, the multidimensional perfectionism scale measures 3 factors of perfectionism. And you'll see both of these in research on gifted students. Now add multiple other measures of perfectionism, factor structures of the construct, and ways to define perfectionism, and you will see that it is difficult to suggest gifted students are more perfectionistic than other students. In the meta-analyses mentioned earlier, in neither study did they find perfectionism as a characteristic of giftedness, despite numerous studies suggesting perfectionism is an issue among gifted people. Rice and Ray in 2018 argued that the inconsistent findings regarding the construct of perfectionism have to do with inconsistent definitions and inconsistent ways of measuring it. Madigan in 2019 found that the measure of perfectionism used in a study actually moderated the relationship between perfectionism and academic achievement. So back to the jangle part of the jingle-jangle fallacy. When two scales with dissimilar names measure similar constructs, this is a jangle fallacy. Evidence of the jangle fallacy in particular can be seen in the study of social, emotional, and psychological constructs. For example, take the construct of overexcitabilities as mentioned in the discussion of the Karpinski et al. Study. I won't go into detail about the construct of overexcitabilities or the Big Five personality factors, except to say that the theory of the big five factors of personality dominates the field of personality and individual differences and is an untapped source of information for the field of gifted education. One of the big five factors, openness, is most associated with high ability and IQ. One of the other big five factors, conscientiousness, is most associated with achievement. When we measure the big five personality factors, or we measure something like overexcitabilities, could it be we are measuring the same or similar constructs, but calling it something different? Could it be that overexcitabilities are better explained by a big five personality factor? A number of recent studies suggest this might be the case. Here you see two ways to measure the big five personality factors. The NEO-PIR is the big five inventory developed to measure the dimensions of the big five identified by Costa and McRae in 1992. They conceptualized the factor openness to be made up of 6 facets. The IPIP is the International Personality Item Pool and is based on Goldberg's work from the 1980s on unipolar markers in personality. The IPIP also conceptualized the openness factor to be made up of multiple facets. So across 2 different measures of personality and 1 measure of overexcitabilities, are we measuring the same or similar constructs? And how has that impacted our understanding of the personalities of gifted and talented people? Further, could overexcitabilities be explained by other constructs, such as sensory processing sensitivity? Sensory processing sensitivity is the result of an underlying phenotypic or temperament trait characterized by greater depth of information processing, increased emotional reactivity and empathy, greater awareness of environmental subtleties, and ease of overstimulation. More research is definitely needed to explore the ways in which the Django fallacy has impacted our understanding of the social and emotional needs and experiences of gifted people. In the same vein as being specific about how we define constructs and how we measure them, and how we define and measure giftedness, we also need to consider the samples of gifted individuals we use in our research on social and emotional development. Fundamental to the notion of intersectionality is the belief that social identities, such as race and gender, intersect in a distinctive way, such that each identity can only be defined through the intersection with other identities. Intersectionality theory finds its roots in Black feminist research, particularly in the work of Crenshaw, who was a prominent figure in critical race studies. Although Crenshaw's work is situated in the legal field, as a Black feminist, she uses intersectionality theory as a tool to address how identity politics have often left women of color marginalized. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Crenshaw argued that feminist and anti-racist discourses have traditionally failed to consider intersectional identities, leaving women of color's experiences and voices silenced. One of the critiques by Black feminist scholars was that traditional feminist research was conducted by white women about the experiences of white women, yet was often generalized to speak for all women. Likewise, Crenshaw makes the case that anti-racist scholarship has often been conducted from the perspective of Black males, thus leaving women of color neglected once again. She suggests that because anti-racist and feminist discourses have traditionally been designed to focus on race or gender exclusively, women of color whose intersectional identities center them as both women and of color are marginalized within both perspectives. Further, intersectionality is not simply used to explain how intersecting marginalized identities operate, but rather it has a political undertone that highlights how the intersection of identities can leave particular groups oppressed. Applying intersectionality to public policy, Hancock states that intersectionality theory is needed to examine policies that are designed to help oppressed groups who should theoretically benefit from racially targeted or gender targeted policy, but in reality, the oppressed groups benefit from neither. Although intersectionality is rarely used to make meaning of the experiences of children and adolescents, Crenshaw's idea of cultural intersectionality can be helpful in illuminating how the intersection of various cultural constructions can reproduce gender and racial hierarchies and disparities among youth. Aggregating students into broad racial ethnic categories occurs at the federal and state level in the US, which affects how students are labeled in schools. This also affects how we conceptualize race and ethnicity in our research studies, since we tend to use the same categories and terminology used from our samples. The US Department of Education recognizes 7 racial and ethnic categories. Within those 7 categories, though, is an immense amount of variation and nuance. This year, Peters called for the use of data disaggregation as a way to help address issues of inequity in gifted education in public schools in the US. We already know gifted individuals are not a homogeneous group, particularly given that we can't all agree on what the term gifted means. But it is not enough within a sample of gifted individuals to compare boys versus girls, for example, or Black students versus white students. In those examples alone, we can see that the experiences of, for example, Black boys and white boys are not the same, even though they are both boys. Further, though the categorization Black represents not only individuals who are descendants of African slaves in the United States, but also a diverse group of immigrants from Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Even further than that, the experiences of a family that recently immigrated from Africa in transient poverty are likely different than a family descended from slavery and generational poverty due to their varying amounts of cultural and social capital. Hodges and colleagues called for the use of data disaggregation beyond just race ethnic categories, including such factors as socioeconomic status and geography to help examine multiple marginalized identities. We can apply the same principle to the study of the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted students, particularly when focusing on marginalized groups. But there are also cultural differences in some aspects of social and emotional development that make cross-cultural comparison challenging in research on the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted students. For example, research shows that the development of social awareness and perspective taking is universal. The developmental trajectory appears to be the same across countries and across cultures. However, there is considerable cultural difference in the way in which we express those competencies. For example, there are cultural differences in emotional display rules, or when it is acceptable to express certain emotions. An example of emotional display would be crying. If we look at the study of gifted students through the idea of data disaggregation and intersectionality, we will deepen our understanding of the social and emotional experiences and needs of diverse groups of students. In that vein, then, research needs to focus on the notion of psychosocial skills that are important in the development of talent, but with an added focus on which skills matter for whom, when, and under what conditions. And can these psychosocial skills be developed through intervention? As mentioned earlier, numerous studies on psychosocial skills exist in the field of gifted education, but only some are operationalized as such. We need more research to understand so many nuances about how psychosocial skills matter in the development of talent. According to Subotnick in 2015, psychosocial skills are the levers of success for the whole talent development process. And the good thing is that they are malleable. Subotnick argued for psychosocial strength training, suggesting that psychosocial skills be explicitly and deliberately cultivated via programming, coaching, and counseling of gifted students as part of their talent development in any domain of ability. So in addition to needing more studies about psychosocial skills themselves, the notions of psychosocial strength training and psychosocial coaching remind us that the study of psychosocial skills needs to be situated in an environment or context. Human development doesn't happen in a vacuum. Human development is something that happens to an individual via interaction with their environment. It's important we conceptualize gifted education and talent development in the same way. We need to conceptualize giftedness, gifted education, and talent development from a systems perspective rather than from isolated perspectives. Many of you are probably familiar with Bronfenbrenner's basic conceptualization of human development from an ecological systems perspective. He focused mostly on context, but he also focused on the developing individual, realizing that although one cannot study individual development out of context, one cannot study context without individual development. He saw the individual as situated within various environments. The microsystem is composed of institutions and groups that most immediately and directly impact the individual's development. For example, a child's microsystems include the home, the classrooms and school, the peer group, and any other groups to which the child belongs, like a sports team or a religious group. The research on microsystems in gifted education, whether or not it is framed that way, is extensive. Plenty of research examines the effects of one's peer group, one's family, one's parents, and one's school on development. The mesosystem is the interactions between microsystems. For example, communication between parents and teachers involves an interaction between the home and the school, which are two very prominent microsystems for children. The exosystem is the interaction between a setting in which the individual does not have an active role and the individual's immediate context. For example, a parent's workplace is an exosystem for a child. The hours a parent works, the parent's income level, stress from work, and other factors all impact the parent's relationship with the child and the amount of time, energy, and financial resources available to the child. The macrosystem is the culture in which one lives, including sociocultural factors, social norms, and expectations. And finally, the chronosystem is the zeitgeist of the time, or the historical period in which one lives. As we know from the field of gifted education, the notions of intelligence and giftedness have evolved over time and have impacted the field of gifted education and talent development. In 2002, Barab and Plucker wrote a paper called Smart People or Smart Contexts, in which they outline the role of context in the identification of giftedness and the development of one's abilities and talents. The idea behind their work is similar to Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. In 2017, Plucker and colleagues wrote, "Talent development is likewise a complex system, with individual students and their unique abilities and potentials interacting with other students, teachers, family members, and other important people within their social circles. In addition, these interactions take place within important cultural and physical contexts. For example, even if the classrooms were identical, the cultural context of a German and a Chinese classroom is clearly different. All of these factors impact how talent emerges and develops, and successful talent development efforts should consider all of these interactions." In the field of gifted education, then, several systems theories exist. Here are some examples. Gagne's integrative model of talent development is a systems theory of talent development that focuses on the interaction between the individual and the environment in the development of talent. From his perspective, a number of environmental and intrapersonal catalysts work together with natural abilities and developmental processes in developing talent, all of which he notes are affected by chance. In the actiotope model of giftedness, Ziegler and colleagues argue gifted education should be concerned with the development of actiotopes, as opposed to the development of individuals or single attributes, such as intelligence or self-concept. In their model, an actiotope denotes the system of an individual and the material, social, and informational environments with which the individual interacts. In 2017, Dye introduced the evolving complexity theory of talent development in reaction to the paradigm shift that occurred in gifted education from the gifted child paradigm to the talent development paradigm. Dye argues the developmental nature of talent is non-reductionist, dynamic, and organismic, and hence involves a systems approach of evolving complexity. Dye described how the elements of domain, person, development, and culture work together as an interacting system. The person is central in the development of talent rather than a domain, such that talent development in a domain does not just happen to a person. A person is the one who organizes and transforms their domain experiences, and who is driven by both endogenous and exogenous forces. The developing individual and their endogenous resources interact with exogenous forces, namely the environmental press and sociocultural mediation. Dye also outlined 4 stages of talent development, describing how cognitive or developmental, affective, and social processes work together to facilitate the development of talent in a person. What Dye and others have done in the development of their systems theories of talent development is take literature from other fields, like psychology, and apply it to what we know in the field of gifted education. The importance of situating an individual in an environment in order to better understand and predict their experiences is clear. We can also incorporate research from other disciplines into the field of gifted education in order to better understand the social and emotional development of gifted students. For example, there is obvious overlap in what we study in the field of gifted education with what some other folks study in other disciplines. The field of developmental psychology is the study of how and why human beings change over the course of their life. This field is subdivided into the dimensions of physical development, cognitive development, and social and emotional development. As discussed earlier regarding theories and stages of human development, we naturally use these as a base from which to explore differences, which is largely what the field of personality and individual differences is concerned with, at least regarding the cognitive and social and emotional dimensions of human development. Social and emotional learning is defined as a process for helping children develop the fundamental skills for life effectiveness and includes recognizing and managing emotions, developing caring and concern for others, establishing positive relationships, making responsible decisions, and handling challenging situations constructively and ethically. In a recently published handbook on social and emotional learning, despite chapters on the social and emotional learning experiences of numerous different groups of students, such as students from varying socioeconomic backgrounds and students with disabilities, there were no chapters on gifted students in that handbook. It is likely their field is as unaware of our field as we are with theirs. But the field of social and emotional learning uses a systems perspective to understand the social and emotional learning that occurs in schools. We could use that body of research to explore the ways in which social and emotional learning might differ for gifted students, for example. And I'll talk about sports psychology and career development and counseling in greater detail. The field of sports psychology is the study of how psychological factors influence sports, athletic performance, exercise, and physical activity. There is obvious overlap here with the field of educational psychology, which is the study of how psychological factors influence the teaching and learning process. The two fields could undoubtedly learn from each other. Faber and colleagues just published a paper in High Ability Studies that is a review of Western approaches to identification and development of talent in schools and in sports contexts. The authors outline the similarities and differences between identification and development of talent across contexts, and then outlined ways in which one domain could use findings from the other domain. There is also quite a lot of information on the relevance of psychosocial skills in the development of athletic talent. For example, Gledhill et al. In 2017 conducted a systematic review of the literature on psychosocial factors associated with the development of talent in football or in American soccer. Across an examination of 43 studies, they identified 22 internal psychological factors, 21 external social factors, and 5 player-level behavioral indicators associated with talent development in football. In looking at the 22 internal psychological factors, the list looks similar to factors that are known to impact achievement and success in academic domains of talent: discipline, self-control, self-awareness, commitment, determination, intrinsic motivation, self-regulation. Many of these are the same as those listed as psychosocial skills in our field. There is also a large body of research on the internal psychological factors associated with talent development in sport that we could use in the field of gifted education. Similarly, we can learn a lot about teaching and mentoring from their literature on coaching, and we could learn about the role parents play in their literature on the role parenting plays in helping kids develop their talents. As another example, career counseling is a form of mentoring. And research derived from the field of career development and counseling would be so helpful to researchers and practitioners in the field of gifted education and talent development. Theories of career development and counseling have existed for decades, and there is an obvious overlap and end goal between our field and theirs, that of matching a unique individual to a domain in a field. There is research on specific career fields too. For example, an entire body of literature exists on academic career development, or the development of an academic's career in higher education. In one of the most widely studied career development theories, Super in 1980 outlined a lifespan life space theory of career development that considers individual and contextual characteristics and focuses on life and career stages, as well as work and non-work roles that people occupy across their lifespan. Super described 5 developmental stages of career development that are loosely tied to age, although he specified that individuals may go through these stages multiple times, irrespective of age. Further, each of super stages are impacted by environmental determinants, such as the labor market, situation determinants, such as historical or socioeconomic factors, and personal determinants, such as psychological or biological factors. We can use Super's work and others like it to enhance and expand on our current theories of talent development. Here I've put Dye's stages in his evolving complexity theory alongside super stages of his lifespan, life-space theory of career development. The overlap here is obvious, as you can see. So how interesting would it be to pull all of the research about Super's theory and apply it to theories of talent development? A very large body of research exists regarding Super's theory, and we really don't look at it at all in the field of gifted education. We could learn a lot about the childhood and adolescent stages of career development, for example, and use that information in a talent development framework during elementary and secondary school. Also, for example, Super discusses how his stages are impacted by environmental determinants, situation determinants, and personal determinants, as mentioned on the last slide. Those same social and emotional determinants are part of the various systems theories of talent development that have emerged in the past couple of decades in our field. We could learn more about how personal determinants like psychological factors, for example, impact career development, and then use that information to better understand the role psychological factors play in talent development. As you can see in the handful of examples I've shared today, there are numerous ways we can advance the study of the social and emotional experiences and needs of gifted individuals. As our definition of giftedness has changed over time, so must our approach to studying and serving gifted students. Again, this list is not exhaustive, but I hope these 5 areas can serve as a springboard for graduate students and early career scholars in particular, but not just those with research interests in the area of social and emotional experiences and needs. Regardless of our paradigmatic lens, our implicit beliefs about giftedness, our backgrounds, or our current positions as researchers and practitioners, we must all have an understanding of the experiences and needs of gifted students in order to continue to help them develop their potentials and talents. If you would like more information, at least about the earlier part of this talk, I go into great detail in my book on social, emotional, and psychosocial development of gifted and talented individuals. I'm also happy to engage with you via email or Twitter if I can answer any questions, or if you'd like to chat further about anything I've covered in this talk. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think that you all had a great presentation there, and I would like to welcome Dr. Rinn on stage to answer some questions. First, Dr. Rinn, I want to thank you for delivering such an interesting keynote. It provided us with a lot to think about as we work to develop the future of gifted education, which is what the theme of this conference is all about. When thinking about identification practices, we often refer back to what's our conception of giftedness as a guide to how we're doing that. I don't think that's a common notion when we're thinking about social and emotional needs and psychosocial skills. So thank you for really highlighting that in this keynote.
Sure, my pleasure.
I want to remind folks that if you have questions for Dr. Rinn, we've already had several of them in the chat. You can go ahead and put them there. We will try to get to some of them, but we cannot get to all of them because they are coming in like crazy, which is a good thing. I want to start off with, you suggest, and it's rightfully suggested, that research has tended to remain siloed where we're unfamiliar with work from related fields or don't use it to inform our understanding of gifted education. What do you think is the first step to changing that?
Well, I think awareness probably is the first step, but I really think that some of the leaders in our field could take some initiative here to broaden our understanding. For example, a number of years ago, excuse me, Stephen Pfeiffer did this for me. I was writing a chapter in a book that he was editing, and I got the first round of revisions back, and it said, well, what about this body of literature? And it was a much larger body of literature than anything that I had included. And it really got me thinking differently. So people like editors or journal editors, professors who are assigning readings for classes, I think that you can start to set an example for students and early career scholars, and maybe it'll catch on. Maybe it'll change the culture a little bit of our field.
And understanding that our paradigmatic approach is an important driver of how we do research, can you discuss what researchers should be considering to ensure they're taking their paradigm into account? And also along those lines, how do we ensure that when people not as well versed in research methods really understand how to read those articles appropriately?
Oh, that's a great question. I always tell people, when you read articles, read it and then think about in your head, what does it say? And then think, and who said it? And then continue to trace that back. Because I think what we find is that we continue to cite each other, and sometimes the original point gets lost in these sort of recitations. And so I encourage people to think critically about it. But I think that we need to outline what we're doing in every study that we do. It isn't enough to just say we're studying gifted people, we're studying talent development, we're studying gifted versus non-gifted. You need to go into greater detail and not assume that your reader or your audience knows what you're talking about. So I think it's completely appropriate to talk about your paradigmatic lens, at least briefly, to define your sample really clearly, so that other people can use that for replication, to think about generalizability and so on.
Thank you. Dr. Plucker has asked a question regarding intersectionality. Intersectionality is a helpful perspective that should be used more in our field, but your comments made me think, and me was Dr. Plucker, about James Moore's concerns about the field primarily focusing on the experiences of Black, Hispanic, and low-income girls. Do you think he has a point, or do we simply need more research on the experiences of all students receiving inadequate resources and services?
I do see his point. I don't think that means we need to stop researching those groups, though. And in fact, I would argue that there's not enough research to begin with, so all groups really are fair game. But to the second part of Dr. Plucker's point, I agree. We just need more research. We need to understand how experiences happen, how different groups of people experience things differently, and just saying, for example, girls versus boys, that's really not going to cut it. And so I think looking a little bit deeper whenever we conduct research on social and emotional development in particular would be helpful, rather than generalizing to just the gifted or all groups.
You mentioned graduate students and early career researchers just a minute ago, and I also mentioned that in my introduction of you because I always hear all the amazing things that you've done for your students and the influence you've had. So for all of the early career researchers and graduate students out there listening right now, what is one piece of advice that you would have for them if they're interested in researching these topics?
That's a good question. Read outside the field extensively. David Dye gave me that advice probably a decade and a half ago, and I think it's fantastic. And I'll tell any graduate student who will listen that there's just more to read than what's going on in our field. But beyond that, if you're a graduate student or early career scholar, I would really emphasize spending a lot of time reading the literature, all the literature in and outside the field, but also learning more about research design and research methods, so that whenever you are reading research, you have a better understanding, A, of what the researchers did, but B, it might help illuminate for you ways to improve upon research that already exists. And as you continue to read and grow as a scholar, eventually you're going to find holes in the literature. And I think that's where you can take the opportunity to jump. If there is an obvious piece missing and we need to know more about topic X, Y, and Z, well, you've discovered it. And so get started with that after you've read everything inside and outside the field.
I saw a tweet the other day. I'm coming up with this question as you're saying that, about sometimes you find a hole in the research and it's there for a reason. How do you encourage those students to maybe explore it a little bit and find out if it's there for a reason or if it's something they really should look into?
That's a really good question too. I think that's where you need to start talking to your mentors, folks in the field who've been around for a lot longer and who may have a better understanding of the big picture nature of research in our field. They might be able to tell you, well, somebody tried that and that didn't work, or there's a reason that's empty and don't touch that for whatever reason. But I think that's where your mentors and advisors can really start to weigh in. But also don't be afraid to take a chance. If you're not sure if a hole ought to be filled, I mean, you can contact the journal editor and ask. You can contact me. I'll be happy to help. But there's people that you can talk to. Just don't feel like you're all alone and out there doing research by yourself.
Thank you. The next question is, do you know if there's any research on the students or adolescents who become celebrities at such a young age and their behavior becomes evident that they do need emotional, social support to maintain balance in their overall development?
Well, that's a great question too. I'm not familiar with any research on like child celebrities, although it certainly may exist. There is research in our field about prodigies and folks who display talent at a very early age. There's research about radically accelerated folks that I think that we could probably bring in to help explain some of the experiences that celebrities and like Olympic stars, we're seeing some of that happening right now with the Olympics. It might help explain some of the difficulties that they face, some of the pressure and some of the social and emotional experiences that aren't great.
I'm glad someone asked that question because I wanted to give a short plug for our Gifted and Talented International Journal. I think that it's probably related to what they are talking about. We have a special issue of GTI coming out that is co-edited by Rina Sabatnik, Paula Ozuski-Kavilius, and Leonie Kronborg on research and practice on connections between talent development and big C creativity or eminence in domains. So I recommend the person that asked that question to check out that journal to see if it answers any of the questions that you have. I think we have time for one more question, perhaps. What's your number one wish for the future of research and or practice in the social and emotional needs and psychosocial skills for gifted students?
My one wish, more research, more. I would say let's collaborate. We are all coming at this with different paradigmatic perspectives, different beliefs, different backgrounds, different experiences, different areas of expertise. I think if we can come together and really share some of our knowledge, we could really start to advance the field. So I would really like to see collaboration across universities, across countries, to see what we can come up with.
Again, thank you, Dr. Rinn, for delivering this thought-provoking keynote presentation. I also want to thank Proofrock Press for sponsoring this keynote. And if you're interested in purchasing Dr. Rinn's book that she talked about, I got this off my shelf from home this afternoon. We do have a 20% discount code for her book that we've received from the publisher. We'll post details about that in the session information. And now you have about 15 minutes to take a stretch break and see you back for concurrent sessions starting soon. Thanks, Dr. Rinn.
Thank you.